Brought to you by WikiVD Documentaries. Project MKUltra. Project MKUltra, sometimes referred to as the CIA's mind control program, is the code name given to a program of experiments on human subjects, at times illegal, designed and undertaken by the United States Central Intelligence Agency. Experiments on humans were intended to identify and develop drugs and procedures to be used in interrogations and torture, in order to weaken the individual to force confessions through mind control. Organized through the Scientific Intelligence Division of the CIA, the project coordinated with the Special Operations Division of the U.S. Army's Chemical Corps. The operation began in the early 1950s, was officially sanctioned in 1953, was reduced in scope in 1964, further curtailed in 1967, and officially halted in 1973. The program engaged in many illegal activities, including the use of unwitting U.S. and Canadian citizens as its test subjects, which led to controversy regarding its legitimacy. MKUltra used numerous methodologies to manipulate people's mental states and alter brain functions, including the surreptitious administration of drugs and other chemicals, hypnosis, sensory deprivation, isolation and verbal abuse, as well as other forms of psychological torture. The scope of Project MKUltra was broad, with research undertaken at 80 institutions, including 44 colleges and universities, as well as hospitals, prisons, and pharmaceutical companies. The CIA operated through these institutions using front organizations, although sometimes top officials at these institutions were aware of the CIA's involvement. As the U.S. Supreme Court later noted in CIA v. Sims 471 U.S. 159, MKULTRA was concerned with the research and development of chemical, biological, and radiological materials capable of employment in clandestine operations to control human behavior. The program consisted of some 149 sub-projects which the agency contracted out to various universities, research foundations, and similar institutions. At least 80 institutions and 185 private researchers participated. Because the agency funded MKUltra indirectly, many of the participating individuals were unaware that they were dealing with the agency. Although the Supreme Court sided with the CIA that sources' names could be redacted for their protection, it nonetheless validated the existence of MKULTRA to be used in future court cases and confirmed that the CIA for 14 years performed clandestine experiments on human behavior. Between 1953 and 1966, the Central Intelligence Agency financed a wide-ranging project, codenamed MKULTRA, concerned with the research and development of chemical, biological, and radiological materials capable of employment in clandestine operations to control human behavior. Project MKUltra was first brought to public attention in 1975 by the Church Committee of the U.S. Congress and a Gerald Ford Commission to investigate CIA activities within the United States. Investigative efforts were hampered by the fact that CIA Director Richard Helms ordered all MKUltra files destroyed in 1973. The Church Committee and Rockefeller Commission investigations relied on the sworn testimony of direct participants and on the relatively small number of documents that survived Helms' destruction order. In 1977, a Freedom of Information Act request uncovered a cache of 20,000 documents relating to Project MKUltra, which led to Senate hearings later that same year. In July 2001, Some surviving information regarding MKUltra was declassified. Precursor experiments. In 1945, the Joint Intelligence Objectives Agency was established and given direct responsibility for Operation Paperclip. The program recruited former Nazi scientists, some of whom had been identified and prosecuted as war criminals during the Nuremberg trials. Several secret U.S. government projects grew out of Operation Paperclip. These projects included Project Chatter and Project Bluebird, which was renamed Project Artichoke in 1951. Their purpose was to study mind control, interrogation, behavior modification and related topics. MKUltra. The project's intentionally obscure CIA cryptonym is made up of the digraph MK, meaning that the project was sponsored by the agency's technical services staff, followed by the word Ultra. Other related cryptonyms include Project MKNAOMI and Project MKDLTA. Headed by Sidney Gottlieb, the MKUltra project was started on the order of CIA Director Alan Welsh Dulles on April 13, 1953. Its aim was to develop mind-controlling drugs for use against the Soviet bloc, largely in response to alleged Soviet, Chinese, and North Korean use of mind control techniques on U.S. prisoners of war in Korea. The CIA wanted to use similar methods on their own captives. The CIA was also interested in being able to manipulate foreign leaders with such techniques, and would later invent several schemes to drug Fidel Castro. Experiments were often conducted without the subject's knowledge or consent. In some cases, academic researchers being funded through grants from CIA-front organizations were unaware that their work was being used for these purposes. The project attempted to produce a perfect truth drug for use in interrogating suspected Soviet spies during the Cold War, and generally to explore any other possibilities of mind control. Another MKUltra effort, Subproject 54, was the Navy's top-secret, Perfect Concussion program, which was supposed to use suboral frequency blasts to erase memory. However, the program was never carried out, because most MKUltra records were deliberately destroyed in 1973. By order of then CIA Director Richard Helms, it has been difficult, if not impossible, for investigators to gain a complete understanding of the more than 150 individually funded research sub-projects sponsored by MKUltra and related CIA programs. The project began during a period of what Rupert Cornwell described as paranoia at the CIA, when the U.S. had lost its nuclear monopoly, and fear of communism was at its height. James Jesus Angleton, head of CIA counterintelligence, believed that the organization had been penetrated by a mole at the highest levels. The agency poured millions of dollars into studies examining methods of influencing and controlling the mind, and of enhancing their ability to extract information from resistant subjects during interrogation. Some historians have asserted that creating a Manchurian candidate subject through mind control techniques was a goal of MKUltra and related CIA projects. Alfred McCoy has claimed that the CIA attempted to focus media attention on these sorts of ridiculous programs, so that the public would not look at the primary goal of the research, which was developing effective methods of torture and interrogation. Such authors cite as one example that the CIA's KUBARK interrogation manual refers to studies at McGill University, and that most of the techniques recommended in KUBARK are exactly those that researcher Donald Ewan Cameron used on his test subjects. One 1955 MKUltra document gives an indication of the size and range of the effort. This document refers to the study of an assortment of mind-altering substances described as follows. MKDELTA. The Church Committee report in 1976 described the MKDELTA program as follows. A special procedure, designated MKDELTA, was established to govern the use of MKUltra materials abroad. Such materials were used on a number of occasions. Because MKUltra records were destroyed, it is impossible to reconstruct the operational use of MKUltra materials by the CIA overseas. It has been determined that the use of these materials abroad began in 1953, and possibly as early as 1950. Drugs were used primarily as an aid to interrogations, but MKUltra/MKDELTA materials were also used for harassment, discrediting, or disabling purposes. MKCHICKWIT. In 1964, MKCHICKWIT was the name given to the continuation of the MKUltra program. The MKCHICK program was divided into two projects dubbed MKOFTEN/CHICKWIT. Funding for MKCHICK commenced in 1965, and ended in 1971. The project was a joint project between the U.S. Army Chemical Corps and the Central Intelligence Agency's Office of Research and Development, to find new offensive use agents with a focus on incapacitating agents. The purpose of the project was to develop, test, and evaluate capabilities in the covert use of biological, chemical, and radioactive material systems and techniques for producing predictable human behavioral and/or physiological changes in support of highly sensitive operational requirements. By March 1971, over 26,000 potential agents had been acquired for future screening. The CIA were interested in bird migration patterns for CBW research under MKUltra, where a sub-project 139 designated bird disease studies at Penn State. MKOFTEN. MKOFTEN was to deal with testing and toxicological, transmissivity, and behavioral effects of drugs in animals and, ultimately, humans. MKCHICKWIT. MKCHICKWIT was concerned with acquiring information on new drug developments in Europe and the Orient, and with acquiring samples. Experiments. CIA documents suggest that chemical, biological and radiological means were investigated for the purpose of mind control as part of MKUltra. An estimated $10 million USD or more was spent. LSD. Early CIA efforts focused on LSD 9/589, which later came to dominate many of MKUltra's programs. The CIA wanted to know if they could make Soviet spies defect against their will, and whether the Soviets could do the same to the CIA's own operatives. Once Project MKUltra officially got underway in April 1953, experiments included administering LSD to mental patients, prisoners, drug addicts and prostitutes, people who could not fight back, as one agency officer put it. In one case, LSD was administered to a mental patient in Kentucky.
for 174 days. LSD was also administered to CIA employees, military personnel, doctors, other government agents, and members of the general public in order to study their reactions. LSD and other drugs were usually administered without the subject's knowledge or informed consent, a violation of the Nuremberg Code that the U.S. agreed to follow after World War II. The aim of this was to find drugs which would irresistibly bring out deep confessions, or wipe a subject's mind clean and program him or her as a robot agent. In Operation Midnight Climax, the CIA set up several brothels in San Francisco, California, to obtain a selection of men who would be too embarrassed to talk about the events. The men were dosed with LSD, the brothels were equipped with one-way mirrors, and the sessions were filmed for later viewing and study. In other experiments, where people were given LSD without the knowledge, they were interrogated under bright lights, with doctors in the background taking notes. The subjects were told that their trips would be extended indefinitely if they refused to reveal their secrets. The people being interrogated this way were CIA employees, U.S. military personnel, and agents suspected of working for the other side in the Cold War. Long-term debilitation and several deaths reportedly resulted from this. Heroin addicts were bribed into taking LSD, with offers of more heroin. The Office of Security used LSD in interrogations, but Dr. Sidney Gottlieb, the chemist who directed MKUltra, had other ideas. He thought it could be used in covert operations, since its effects were temporary. He believed it could be given to high-ranking officials, and in this way affect the course of important meetings, speeches, etc. Since he realized there was a difference in testing the drug in a laboratory and using it in clandestine operations, he initiated a series of experiments where LSD was given to people in normal settings without warning. At first, everyone in technical services tried it. A typical experiment involved two people in a room, where they observed each other for hours and took notes. As the experimentation progressed, a point was reached where outsiders were drugged with no explanation whatsoever, and surprise acid trips became something of an occupational hazard among CIA operatives. Adverse reactions often occurred. For example, an operative who had received the drug in his morning coffee became psychotic and ran across Washington, seeing a monster in every car that passed him. The experiments continued even after Dr. Frank Olson, an Army scientist who had not taken LSD before, went into deep depression after a surprise trip, and later fell from a 13th-story window. Some subjects' participation was consensual, and in these cases they appeared to be singled out for even more extreme experiments. In one case, 7 volunteers in Kentucky were given LSD for 77 consecutive days. LSD was eventually dismissed by MKUltra's researchers as too unpredictable in its results. They had given up on the notion that LSD was the secret that was going to unlock the universe, but it still had a place in the cloak and dagger arsenal. However, by 1962 the CIA and the Army had developed a series of super hallucinogens such as the highly touted BZ, which was thought to hold greater promise as a mind control weapon. This resulted in the withdrawal of support by many academics and private researchers, and LSD research became less of a priority altogether. Other drugs. Another technique investigated was connecting a barbiturate IV into one arm and an amphetamine IV into the other. The barbiturates were released into the person first, and as soon as the person began to fall asleep, the amphetamines were released.
The person would then begin babbling incoherently, and it was sometimes possible to ask questions and get useful answers. Other experiments involved heroin, morphine, temazepam, mescaline, psilocybin, scopolamine, marijuana, alcohol, and sodium pentothal. Hypnosis. Declassified MKUltra documents indicate hypnosis was studied in the early 1950s. Experimental goals included the creation of hypnotically induced anxieties, hypnotically increasing ability to learn and recall complex written matter, studying hypnosis and polygraph examinations, hypnotically increasing ability to observe and recall complex arrangements of physical objects, and studying relationship of personality to susceptibility to hypnosis. Experiments were conducted with drug-induced hypnosis and with anterograde and retrograde amnesia while under the influence of such drugs. Canadian experiments. The experiments were exported to Canada when the CIA recruited Scottish psychiatrist Donald Ewan Cameron, creator of the psychic driving concept, which the CIA found particularly interesting. Cameron had been hoping to correct schizophrenia by erasing existing memories and reprogramming the psyche. He commuted from Albany, New York, to Montreal every week to work at the Allen Memorial Institute of McGill University and was paid $69,000 from 1957 to 1964 to carry out MKUltra experiments there. These research funds were sent to Dr. Cameron by a CIA front organization, the Society for the Investigation of Human Ecology. And, as shown in internal CIA documents, Cameron did not know that the money originated from the CIA. In addition to LSD, Cameron also experimented with various paralytic drugs as well as electroconvulsive therapy at 30 to 40 times the normal power. His driving experiments consisted of putting subjects into drug-induced coma for weeks at a time while playing tape loops of noise or simple repetitive statements. His experiments were typically carried out on patients who had entered the institute for minor problems such as anxiety disorders and postpartum depression, many of whom suffered permanently from his actions. His treatments resulted in victims' incontinence, amnesia, forgetting how to talk, forgetting their parents, and thinking their interrogators were their parents. His work was inspired and paralleled by the British psychiatrist William Sargant at St Thomas's Hospital, London, and Belmont Hospital, Surrey, who was also involved in the intelligence services, and who experimented extensively on his patients without their consent, causing similar long-term damage. In the 1980s, several of Cameron's former patients sued the CIA for damages, which was documented by the Canadian news program The Fifth Estate. Their experiences and subsequent lawsuit was later made into a 1998 television miniseries called The Sleep Room. During this era, Cameron became known worldwide as the first chairman of the World Psychiatric Association as well as president of the American and Canadian Psychiatric Associations. Cameron had also been a member of the Nuremberg Medical Tribunal in 1946–47. Naomi Klein argues in her book The Shock Doctrine that Cameron's research and his contribution to the MKUltra project was actually not about mind control and brainwashing, but about designing a scientifically based system for extracting information from resistant sources, in other words, torture. Alfred W. McCoy writes that, stripped of its bizarre excesses, Dr. Cameron's experiments, building upon Donald O. Hebb's earlier breakthrough, laid the scientific foundation for the CIA's two-stage psychological torture method, which refers to first creating a state of disorientation in the subject, and then second creating a situation of self-inflicted discomfort in which the disoriented subject can alleviate their pain by capitulating. Revelation. In 1973, with the government-wide panic caused by Watergate, the CIA Director Richard Helms ordered all MKUltra files destroyed. Pursuant to this order, most CIA documents regarding the project were destroyed, making a full investigation of MKUltra impossible. A cache of some 20,000 documents survived Helms' purge, as they had been incorrectly stored in a financial records building, and were discovered following a FOIA request in 1977. These documents were fully investigated during the Senate hearings of 1977. In December 1974, the New York Times alleged that the CIA had conducted illegal domestic activities, including experiments on U.S. citizens, during the 1960s. That report prompted investigations by the U.S. Congress, in the form of the Church Committee, and by a presidential commission known as the Rockefeller Commission that looked into domestic activities of the CIA, the FBI, and intelligence-related agencies of the military. In the summer of 1975, Congressional Church Committee reports and the Presidential Rockefeller Commission report revealed to the public, for the first time, that the CIA and the Department of Defense had conducted experiments on both unwitting and cognizant human subjects as part of an extensive program to influence and control human behavior through the use of psychoactive drugs such as LSD and mescaline, and other chemical, biological, and psychological means. They also revealed that at least one subject had died after administration of LSD. Much of what the Church Committee and the Rockefeller Commission learned about MKUltra was contained in a report prepared by the Inspector General's office in 1963, that had survived the destruction of records ordered in 1973. However, it contained little detail. Sidney Gottlieb, who had retired from the CIA 2 years previously, was interviewed by the committee, but claimed to have very little recollection of the activities of MKUltra. The Congressional Committee investigating the CIA research, chaired by Senator Frank Church, concluded that prior consent was obviously not obtained from any of the subjects. The committee noted that the experiments sponsored by these researchers call into question the decision by the agencies not to fix guidelines for experiments. Following the recommendations of the Church Committee, President Gerald Ford in 1976 issued the first executive order on intelligence activities which, among other things, prohibited experimentation with drugs on human subjects except with the informed consent, in writing and witnessed by a disinterested party, of each such human subject, and in accordance with the guidelines issued by the National Commission. Subsequent orders by Presidents Carter and Reagan expanded the directive to apply to any human experimentation. In 1977, during a hearing held by the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence to look further into MKUltra, Admiral Stansfield Turner, then Director of Central Intelligence, revealed that the CIA had found a set of records, consisting of about 20,000 pages, that had survived the 1973 destruction orders, because they had been stored at a records center not usually used for such documents. These files dealt with the financing of MKUltra projects and contained few project details. However, much more was learned from them than from the Inspector General's 1963 report. On the Senate floor in 1977, Senator Ted Kennedy said, "The deputy director of the CIA revealed that over 30 universities and institutions were involved in an extensive testing and experimentation program which included covert drug tests on unwitting citizens, at all social levels, high and low, Native Americans and foreign. Several of these tests involved the administration of LSD to unwitting subjects in social situations. At least one death, the result of the defenestration of Dr. Frank Olson, was attributed to Olson's being subjected, unaware, to such experimentation, 9 days before his death. The agency itself subsequently acknowledged that these tests had little scientific rationale. The agents conducting the monitoring were not qualified scientific observers." In Canada, the issue took much longer to surface, becoming widely known in 1984 on a CBC News show, The Fifth Estate. It was learned that not only had the CIA funded Dr. Cameron's efforts, but perhaps even more shockingly, the Canadian government was fully aware of this, and had later provided another $500,000 in funding to continue the experiments. This revelation largely derailed efforts by the victims to sue the CIA as their U.S. counterparts had, and the Canadian government eventually settled out of court for $100,000 to each of the 127 victims. Dr. Cameron died on September 8, 1967 after suffering a heart attack while he and his son were mountain climbing. None of Cameron's personal records of his involvement with MKUltra survived, since his family destroyed them after his death. 1984 U.S. General Accounting Office Report. The U.S. General Accounting Office issued a report on September 28, 1984, which stated that between 1940 and 1974, DOD and other national security agencies studied thousands of human subjects in tests and experiments involving hazardous substances. The quote from the study: "Working with the CIA, the Department of Defense gave hallucinogenic drugs to thousands of volunteer soldiers in the 1950s and 1960s. In addition to LSD, the Army also tested quinacridinal benzylate, a hallucinogen codenamed BZ. Many of these tests were conducted under the so-called MKUltra program, established to counter perceived Soviet and Chinese advances in brainwashing techniques. Between 1953 and 1964, the program consisted of 149 projects involving drug testing and other studies on unwitting human subjects." Thank you for watching. Brought to you by WikiVD Documentaries. Please like and subscribe below. Please like and subscribe below.